I would love to welcome you all to our first panel this morning. It's called Stirring the Pot, Myths About Beans. And we are going to be addressing some common misconceptions and misinformation. So with that, I'd like to welcome up some of the panelists that will be joining today. And as Rebecca mentioned, I'm Jessica Hegarty. I am VP of Product Development and Strategy for a company called Plant Strong, which is a rapidly growing plant-based CPG company in the US. And I'm going to tell you more about Plant Strong in another session because I want to get as much time as possible with our fantastic panelists and save time at the end to answer your questions. So as I mentioned, this panel, we're going to be addressing the 4 most common myths about beans and then open it up for a Q&A. The significance here and the reason that we wanted to come together and address these myths is that we collectively, every person in this room, has the same objective. We have a really heavy marketing lift to do with this incredible food, and we need all hands on deck to change these perceptions. So our job, as we see it, is to equip you with the information necessary to help combat some of these myths. So with that, let me introduce you to our panel of experts. We have here Allison Greenhalgh-Ball, aka AGB. She is an executive with over 25 years of experience in the public health sector, including her role as a global nutrition lead at the Kellogg Company. She is a board member for several public and private organizations, and most notably the vice chair of the British Nutrition Foundation. She's also the founder of Conscious Impact, a board group dedicated to helping organizations build stronger food systems. And she's also a core member of Beans is How. Next, we have Chelsea Dittinger. She's a food science and human nutrition PhD student at Colorado State University. She is also executive director for the Colorado Dry Bean Committee. She is founder of A Legume a Day, part website, part passion project for the purpose of educating consumers about all things beans. And up here on the screen, getting his physical movement in on that walking treadmill is Dr. Michael Greger. He is a licensed general practitioner who specializes in clinical nutrition. He's a founding member and fellow of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine. He's an internationally recognized public speaker on nutrition, food safety, and public health issues. And he is also a New York Times best-selling author, including the author of one of my favorite books, How Not to Die. There's also a sequel, How Not to Diet, How to Survive a Pandemic, because his publisher wouldn't let him name it How Not to Die in a Pandemic. He also has a book coming out in December called How Not to Age. So of course, I think this ties nicely with the Blue Zones. I'm very excited about that book because Dr. Greger is actually a personal hero of mine, and you can see a lot of the influence of the information that he's shared with the world in the Plant Strong products that I create. So we are going to kick things off with a short video from Dr. Greger. You can find this video and more at his not-for-profit evidence-based nutrition website, nutritionfacts.org, which he created as a public service. And if you're not familiar with this website, I highly suggest that you check it out. I actually wanted to incorporate 5 videos from nutritionfacts.org into our presentation, and we narrowed it down to 1 because there was simply not enough time. So with that, I think we did a good job of picking, oh, there we go. I think we did a really good job of picking a video that addresses one of the most common hurdles to getting consumers to eat beans, and that is fear of flatulence. So with that,
legumes may be the most important predictor of survival in older people from around the globe. They looked at 5 different cohorts in Japan, Sweden, Greece, and Australia. And of all the food factors they looked at, only one was associated with a longer lifespan across the board: legume intake. Whether it was the Japanese eating their soy, the Swedes eating their brown beans and peas, or those in the Mediterranean eating lentils, chickpeas, and white beans. Only for legumes intake Was the result plausible, consistent, and statistically significant from the data across all the populations combined? We're talking an 8% reduction in risk of death for every 20 grams increase in daily legumes intake. That's just like 2 tablespoons worth. So if a can of beans is 250 grams and you get 8% lower mortality for every 20 grams, maybe if we eat a can a day, we'll live forever? Let's find out. If you want to increase your lifespan, eat beans. If, however, you're suicidal and want to decrease your lifespan, a bean-free diet may increase the risk of death. So, having arrived at the one dietary fountain of youth, what's the number one reason people aren't clamoring for them? Fear of flatulence. So is that the choice we're left with? Breaking wind or breaking down? Passing gas or passing on? Turns out that people's concerns about excessive flatulence from eating beans may be exaggerated. Add a half a cup of beans every day to people's diet for months, and what happens? What's the number one symptom? Nothing. The vast majority of people experience no symptoms at all, though a few % did report increased flatulence. So it may occur in some individuals, but not all people are affected. And even among those that were, 70% or more of the participants who experienced flatulence felt it dissipated, no pun intended, by the second or third week of bean consumption. So we just got to stick to it. And a small percentage reported increased flatulence on the control diet without any beans. People have preconceived notions about beans, such that just the expectation of flatulence from eating beans may influence their perceptions of having gas. They didn't actually measure farts in the study. They just asked people what their perception of the amount of gas they had was. And we know from previous studies that you give someone a product labeled to contain something that may cause intestinal distress, and it causes more intestinal distress whether it actually contains the ingredient or not. In other words, just thinking they were eating it caused digestive distress, or the perception of it, to a proportion of persons. So, people thinking beans are going to cause gas may just be more likely to notice the gas they normally have. Either way, it tends to go away. After a few weeks of daily bean consumption, people perceive their flatulence occurrence returns to normal levels. In this other study, where they added more than a half a cup of kidney beans to people's daily diets, the research subjects reported that the discomfort they initially felt within the first day or two of adding beans quickly disappeared. So again, stick with it. Bottom line, no pun intended, an increasing body of research in the latest dietary guidelines supports the benefits of a plant-based diet, and legumes specifically, in the reduction of chronic disease risks. In some people, it may result in more flatulence initially. However, doctors should emphasize that it will decrease over time if we just keep it up, and the nutritional attributes of beans in the diet outweighs the potential for transitory discomfort. The long-term health benefits of bean consumption are great. And indeed, eating beans in the long term may make your term on Earth even longer.
Excellent. Well, too many opportunities for puns when you're talking about beans and flatulence. In case you missed it, I think the takeaway there is that excessive flatulence from bean consumption may be exaggerated. And even if it wasn't, it's kind of a small price to pay for something where 2 tablespoons of daily consumption reduces your risk of death by 8%. I mean, that is some powerful stuff. Alice and Chelsea, feel free to share your thoughts on, the issue of flatulence, which again, self-reporting, some studies show that that's the number one reason that people might not eat beans and legumes.
I love talking about flatulence. So
Who doesn't?
I get lots of invites for dinner because I talk about farting or flatulence. But I think it's a really important topic to literally take the lid off. And we kind of talk in hushed tones about flatulence. We almost feel embarrassed to talk about it. And I know that's different around the world. But we should be talking about it because we should be celebrating it. You know, that literally, that party in your pants, and it is a party sometimes, isn't it, is a real positive. Why is it a positive? You know, that slight discomfort is actually your bacteria in your microbiome that's so important for you. They're literally having a party. You're feeding them, you're nourishing them, you're giving them like this fertilizer, and they're celebrating. And they're celebrating by fermenting that amazing food. And they're producing byproducts of gas, but also making essential kind of energy for you, short-chain fatty acids that are so beneficial for your health.
So beneficial.
So let's celebrate that party in your pants.
Right.
But, you know, from a real practical point of view, yes, you know, your microbiome does get kind of used to it, and so that can settle. But thinking about timings, so, you know, my mother, she hates me talking about this because I do, but my mother, my lovely mummy, she loves beans. She also loves line dancing. And so the two sometimes are not that compatible, if you think about it. So she avoids kind of having beans before she kind of struts her stuff on the dance floor. Sure. So that's just a really practical thing of, you know, if you are going to get a little bit of flatulence, if it's not okay in the situation, just think about your timings as well. But let's celebrate it.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Special tip from AGB's mom: don't eat beans before you go line dancing.
Yeah, I don't know if I can really top saying something is a party in your pants there, but one thing I'd like to add too is that beans are really rich in fiber, and that's one of the reasons that maybe if you even experience any symptoms, you may in the beginning. So it's not just beans though, right? If you're having a really low fiber diet and you switch to a healthier diet, it takes time for your body to adapt. So people sometimes kind of villainize beans, but we want that healthy diet. We want that fiber in our diet, and beans are a great way to accomplish that.
That's a great point.
So do you think about fermentation? You know, we all love fermentation, whether it's bread, whether it's sauerkraut, you know, whether it's pineapple. What do we do when we see those bubbles? We say it's working, don't we? You know, you see those little bubbles kind of come up on your kombucha or your kind of sourdough starter, and you say it's working. It's the same thing, it's working.
Yeah, it's working. That makes sense. And I think a lot of us who are traveling, you know, we might be eating things that are a little bit different. I feel like with any dietary change, there's going to be some gastrointestinal shifts, right? No matter what, if you're switching your diet to eat beans or switching your diet to something that's a little bit different, things are going to move a little bit differently for that transition period. So eating a diet of beans is no exception.
And one other last comment there for me is that one of the great things about beans is how incredibly versatile they are. So different people will react differently to different types of beans. So again, a lot of the times people don't experience any symptoms to begin with, or they go away really quickly. But if a particular type of bean maybe doesn't agree with you, or doesn't agree with somebody in your family or your friend group, then you can encourage them, well, try a different type. You know?
Yeah, that's a great point. Well, with that, we can move on to our second hurdle, and that is the prevalence of a considerable amount of nutritional misinformation that exists about beans. There are compounds in beans that have been labeled anti-nutrients, which is really scary for a food trying to be in the health food space. And it's also been called an incomplete protein, which implies that they are lacking in some way. So let's talk about some of these issues. And I'll share that when this team came together to start talking about how to address some of these hurdles, one of the things that we recognize is that there seems to be a regional flavor, if you will, for this type of nutritional information. So Google Trends tells us that lectins are more of an issue in the United States and also in Canada. Let's start there. Chelsea, can you explain kind of what lectins are, and are those concerns valid?
Yeah, absolutely. But first, I want to ask all of you a question. So I'm going to ask you to be brave and raise your hand. So my question for you is, when you eat beans, do you eat dry, like rock hard dry beans, or do you eat cooked dry beans? It's not a trick question. Who likes to eat rock hard dry beans? Great, so we all have our teeth left in this room. That's wonderful. Who likes to eat cooked beans? Great. So that pretty much means that lectins are probably not a concern for all of us. So lectins are an issue that is often more clickbait than anything else. And I know it may not be a concern for all parts of the world, but like Jessica was saying, in some regions it is. Lectins are essentially a carbohydrate-binding protein, and they can cause intestinal discomfort. We're not talking about gas again here, or it could cause other upset, maybe vomiting or something. But beans aren't the only thing with lectins. Other plant foods also have lectins. And here's the really important part. Cooking beans, so if you're eating adequately cooked beans, we have really strong scientific evidence all the lectin activity is eliminated. So lectins play an important role in the plant, that's why they're there, but when we cook them and we're eating these adequately cooked beans, lectins are a non-issue. So good, happy news there, and if you're working with bean flours or something, again, we just want to make sure we're cooking the beans and then it's not something we need to worry about.
Great, so there's kind of a protective mechanism. If you can chew it, probably shouldn't eat it because the lectins are going to be high, but if it's been processed and cooked and it's softer, and a reasonable person would eat it without hassle, the lectins are probably less of an issue.
Well, and even again with that variety of beans, not all beans are even high in lectins to begin with. Mm-hmm. So again, it's one of those issues that's really exaggerated, and that's kind of a trend we'll see today, right?
Gotcha, fear tactics. And as I mentioned, moving on to the next kind of bit of anti-nutrient information, phytic acid, seems to be an issue, at least talked about more so in the UK. Can you share some of your observations, Alison, and talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure it's an issue with the everyday kind of person. You know, we certainly kind of cite phytates, I would say, more than lectins in Europe. And one thing I would say is, I think it's a bit of an unfair label that beans kind of get the anti-nutrient label, when actually, phytates are in kind of seeds and nuts and whole grains. So all these foods contain kind of phytates. And yes, they do interfere with some of the kind of absorptions of some of the minerals, such as iron and calcium, magnesium and zinc. But as you said, if you cook or you soak, then, that's kind of significantly kind of reduced. And, we know through kind of some of the literature that, those people who regularly eat these food groups, can adapt to that absorption. They can, so there's not an issue necessarily with that kind of those mineral intakes. But what we don't talk about is that these phytates, have a beneficial impact on your body as well. They're powerful antioxidants. And so let's just reframe this a little, just take it down. It's not just beans, it's all these kind of other food groups. And actually, they can be beneficial. And let's reframe it. You've got a great term that you want to kind of rebrand them, if you like. You've got your A&P budget to rebrand it.
So we're all ready in this room to work together and rebrand this. So my mentor is Dr. Henry Thompson. He's kind of a bean guru around the world. And he's encouraging folks, rather than saying anti-nutrients, which sounds scary and really it doesn't represent the reality. Like you said, they're also, for instance, powerful antioxidants. But let's not say anti-nutrients, let's say bean bioactives, right? These are compounds that when you're having beans in a healthy, diverse diet, these can actually have health benefits. So let's avoid the clickbait and let's use more positive words that represent the realities.
I like that. So takeaway for the group. Anti-nutrients, let's not use that term. Bean bioactives is a better representation of what it actually is. And there's a marketing benefit to that as well. Great. Moving on to the third consideration, and this hasn't been verified with Google Trends, but kind of anecdotally, we know that gout from eating beans can be considered an issue. We've heard stories about it being talked about in Central America and Asia as well. Can one of you speak to that? Maybe you, Alison, or Chelsea?
Yeah, I can do that. So we have purines written up here because gout, what that is basically is when your body processes purines, it breaks it down into uric acid, and these can, theoretically, if they're not cleared well for whatever reason, they can cause, these uric crystals that can kind of accumulate in joints and cause inflammation. It sounds bad, right? So the question is, well, do beans cause gout because they have purines in them, as other foods do as well? But the recommendation used to be to kind of avoid purine-rich foods to reduce risk for gout, or if you already have experiencing gout symptoms. These days, it's actually transitioning more towards maintaining a healthy body weight, which is something that actually beans can help you do. So there's that. But if we're looking at should you avoid beans because of purines, then there are studies that they do look into that, and they've looked at different food groups and everything, and they've looked at the purine-rich vegetables, which beans fall under that. They looked at beans specifically as well. And guess what? The answer is no. So beans do not associate with a higher risk for gout. And in fact, in some of the studies, it was actually showing a little bit of a protective effect. Now, if you're looking into, well, why could that be if they have high purine content when some of the other high purine foods were associating with higher risk for gout? That might be because of different bioavailability in different foods. So perhaps the purines in beans, they may have a lower bioavailability to break down into this uric acid. So, scientists are looking into it and everything, but the bottom line is that no, beans do not seem to be associated with a higher risk for gout.
Great. And I love that they also perhaps have a protective effect. That's powerful stuff.
Yeah.
So excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Chelsea. And then moving on to our next consideration, as I mentioned, this idea of macronutrients. And this is also kind of more of a global consideration, beans being high in carbs or beans being an incomplete protein. Allison, can you share maybe a little bit about, what that means?
Yeah, well, let's start with incomplete protein. Gosh, that's kind of complicated for people to understand, isn't it? What does that actually mean? So proteins, as you may or may not know, are made up of kind of building blocks of amino acids. And so to have a complete protein means that you've got all of those amino acids. And there's about 9 of them that you need to kind of eat from food because you can't produce them yourself. And so beans typically are missing a couple of those. Is that an issue? No. I'll tell you why. Because often you get those kind of missing kind of amino acids from other food sources in your diet. So typically grains have those that are missing in beans and vice versa. So it's this perfect kind of marriage made in heaven, if you like. So this lovely complementary kind of aspects of combining foods. Certainly when I was training many years ago, because I'm quite ancient, in the UK we eat beans on toast. It's a very typical kind of snack or kind of lunch dish. And we were taught that that's a perfect combination. It means that you're getting all the amino acids that you need for the day. So again, don't kind of stress it, or you have to have all your amino acids in that meal or that snack. You don't. Think about during the day, think about during the week. We need to have kind of all these food groups on our plate. And if you're doing that, you're going to be okay.
That's great. That's great. And I think there's a misconception that you need to eat the beans and the grain in the same meal.
No.
That's not necessarily true, right?
No.
Yeah.
Okay. You can eat them maybe the next day or later that week. As long as you're eating it in some form, you're going
Let's be clear, all the dietary guidelines around the world say you should be having grains every day. Okay.
True.
Yeah. So if you're following that, you're going to be okay.
That's a great point. That's a great point.
Yeah.
Excellent.
The amino acids that are low in beans, it's not like a zero. It's just they're really limited.
just low.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So when people say, oh, they're completely missing them, that's not true either. It's just low. So again, have a diverse, varied diet. Beans are a great part of that.
Yeah, diverse, varied diet. Great point. Thank you.
Do we want to talk about carbs at all?
Oh, sure. Yes, if you'd like to.
So I think one thing that I don't know about where you are living, but one thing that I get asked a lot is, oh, but beans have lots of carbs and that's bad for me. And it just kind of makes me pause. And it's like, no, carbs are not bad for you. Carbs are a really important part of your diet. And also, all carbs are not the same in the sense of, or all food sources of carbs are not the same, because a piece of maybe, refined white bread or something is not the same thing as beans, right? Those are very different carbs, and the carbs in beans are those complex carbohydrates, and they break down slower in our body. Beans have that low glycemic index, so don't start panicking about carbohydrates. We need them, and beans have really good carbohydrates.
Yeah, eating 20 carbs of beans, the effect on your blood sugar is going to look very different than eating 20 carbs of, white bread or some other refined grain. That makes sense. All right. Well, I think it's interesting that it's this nutritional misinformation that leads to fad diets that really villainize beans. And in the U.S., you can see the popularity of programs like Whole30, where they are citing high levels of phytates as the reason to completely eliminate beans from your diet. Keto, I don't know if you all have heard of this type of diet that's very popular in the US at this moment. They believe that beans are they're high in fiber and that's great, but they're too high in carbohydrates and too low in fat to be part of the keto diet. And then paleo cites the phytic acid being an issue as well. What I'm feeling relief towards is that, yes, you see spikes during these New Year's resolutions. That's what all of these spikes in interest are. But the overall macro trend of these bean eliminating diets, thankfully, is declining, which, I feel a sense of relief towards for humanity.
Totally. That is just such a pleasing chart, to see them kind of continue to go down.
Yes.
And, the demonizing food groups that are so important for our health.
That's right.
It's not right.
It's not
and
right.
It's confusing.
It is.
Yeah,
it is.
So
moving on to our third hurdle. So we know flatulence is exaggerated. Beans aren't going to give you gout. Now that you're ready to eat them, there's some confusion about which format for beans might be best. So considering, canned beans versus dry beans, which one of these should the average consumer pursue? And in evaluating these two formats, we looked at 4 things. We looked at the nutritional differences, carbon footprint, value per serving, and convenience. So, nutrition. Beans are technically a processed food, right? Canned beans are processed, and it's kind of a mysterious black box that customers don't know about what happens from picking the beans until they get into these cans that are shelf stable for months, if not years. There's got to be crazy amounts of preservatives that are, added to canned beans. So, Chelsea, would you like to unpack that a little bit for us? What are the nutritional differences between canned and dry? Well,
first of all, I'd like to again say lots of misinformation out there, right? There are not all these crazy preservative added. Canned beans are really a very healthy option. And I know we were talking about kind of the sodium levels, so I don't know if you wanted to share a bit about that.
Do you know, this is again, demonizing, isn't it? So we love to create kind of what I say, heroes and villains in food, because it makes it easier for us to understand. So what's good and what's bad. Actually, these are both amazing, So if you think, and whether it's processed, all food is processed, So let's kind of just take a step back and understand, if you're processing foods and beans in particular in the home, and you're also doing that via kind of canned, the nutritional kind of difference is really kind of negligible. And if you can kind of compare that to other food groups, we should be celebrating both canned and kind of dried beans within your diet. So it's really minuscule. There's lots and lots of kind of options out there. If you think about cans, they're often could be in kind of salted water, but most people add salt in the home.
That's right.
Or actually, on the shelves, kind of in Europe, a lot of kind of canned beans have no sodium in them. They're presented in kind of in a water base.
Yeah.
So there are lots of options out there, and let's not sweat the differences between canned and dried. Eat both.
Yes.
Eat
Excellent.
both.
Eat both. That's great. Yes, and there are a lot of no added sodium options where you can just add salt to taste whenever you prepare it, which gives customers a lot of options. And then I think to your point, Chelsea, earlier about being free from preservatives, it really has more to do with the sterile process, sterile canning process, and not that they're adding some sort of preservative or additive.
Right, and there are canned beans and sauces that might have some sugars or something, but there are also the ones that are just a low sodium or no sodium, just the beans too. So there are lots of available options for consumers to choose what works in their diets.
Great. And so tell me, what's the difference in terms of carbon footprint from something like a can or a Tetra Pak? I don't know if you all are familiar with that, the kind of boxy packaging, between those, shelf stable, ready to eat options and something like a dry bean.
Yeah, dry cooked in the home. So as is the answer to a lot of questions in science, it depends, right? So it depends on what type of bean, it depends on how they were harvested, it depends on how far they were shipped. All of these different options and factors go into it. But a recent study that came out about a year ago in Europe looked at several different types of beans, and they compared dry beans cooked in the home and they also compared canned beans. And they looked at a life cycle assessment, so basically from when the beans are on the farm to when they are consumed by consumers. And they found that the dry beans cooked in the home did have a bit lower of a carbon footprint, and it depended on the type of bean. It was anywhere from 1 to 4-fold or something. So you look at that and you're like, okay, well, the author's conclusion is going to be, never eat canned beans, just eat dry beans. But that wasn't the conclusion, right? Because at the end of the day, whether it's a canned bean or whether it's a dry bean you cooked in the home, it's still a bean. We have those huge public and environmental health wins. So are there reasons to have canned? Yes. Are there reasons to have dry cooked in the home? Yes. We're advocates for eating more beans in general. But one of the main points of the authors was that for some lifestyles, for some consumers, canned beans may be more convenient. So if using canned beans meant that people are eating more beans, that's better than just not including beans because you have to cook them and you don't have time. Because ultimately, canned beans or dry beans, both were a lot better for the environment than, for instance, the other animal proteins they were looking at.
That's a great point. That's a great point. So compared to any other animal protein, beans have a significantly lower carbon footprint, whether they're dry or canned or wherever you're getting them from.
Of course, it depends, but generally.
Yeah. Okay, great. And moving on to kind of the financial reasons that we're starting to touch on there. Of course, it depends on the brand, the variety, the volume, the attributes, but generally, dry beans are considerably less expensive than canned beans. Allison, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about the financial differences per se between the two of these.
Again, that's nuanced, isn't it?
Totally.
So yes, there might be kind of a dried, sometimes kind of cheaper, but what's the cost of kind of cooking those beans? Especially kind of the rising cost of kind of energy. However, let's put this into perspective again. So, they're pretty affordable. They're pretty cheap and they're accessible around the world. And as such, they're a great choice for people who are kind of trying to eat well on a limited budget. So if you compare the cost of beans, whether kind of dried or canned, versus kind of different sources of protein, it's wildly different. So they are the affordable choice. I think we're splitting hairs here.
Yeah.
So again, let's just kind of put it into context. Let's put it into, if you did an algorithm of nutrient density / cost, I bet you'd be hard to find another kind of food source that delivers on both.
Yeah, I think I think that's a great point. Excellent. Well, and you touched on the convenience too. I think for anybody who values their time, if you put a dollar amount with your hourly time on, this earth, it makes sense that, canned beans are probably on par with, cooking dry beans in the home. I don't know if you all do that. If you're thinking about flights and, this one's 2 hours shorter, there's less of a layover, and you go with the more expensive but faster option because you value your time. I think that's kind of what's tying these together.
We have to make it all work, don't we? And, there's a different kind of option for you depending kind of where you are in that moment of your life. So if you're busy kind of trying to cook dinner whilst kind of finishing your conference calls and the kids are screaming because they're really hungry, that canned option is perfect for you. Likewise, if it's a leisurely day and you've got time to make a beautiful soup and you can cook those beans beforehand, then amazing. So all can fit, I think, beautifully into your diet and life.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Lots of kitchen equipment really allows you to conveniently cook with dry beans too, if it's an option, right? So there are pressure cookers, there are electric and traditional ones, there are slow cookers, there are stovetop. So it really, or canned, pouches. So beans really can fit into any lifestyle. And personally, I know a lot of folks I work with to cook up a large batch and you freeze them. So you have those available if you want to be working with the dry beans too. Tons of options there. And then a fun little thing also is that bean breeders are also helping with this too. One of the attributes they look at for beans is cooking time. It's important for consumers, it's important for companies to have varieties that don't take forever to cook. So thank you to bean breeders who are making sure that the cooking times are also good because it saves time, it's more convenient, it also saves energy, so more environmental wins there.
That's great. And we know that there's been an increase in, pressure cooker use in the U.S.
Definitely.
That's kind of a set it and forget it If you're able to kind of plan ahead. That's
Right.
something
I
that you can do.
think Nick Buettner mentioned that yesterday, right? He just cooks that up every morning or often.
Yep, it's really easy. Well, great. Well, I think the kind of conclusion when we're evaluating all of these different considerations is the best way of cooking beans is
Whatever works for you.
whatever gets you to eat more beans, whatever works for your lifestyle, and whatever gets you to eat more beans.
And I think bean flours will have more to share about that as well, too.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So, Allison, you kind of inspired this marketing idea that I think is really wonderful, and that is the idea maybe beans can take a note from the wine industry's playbook. And when producers are making these beans with different flavors and different subtleties, grapes in wine, taste different with each vintage, with whatever environmental factors are involved in producing them. Perhaps the same can be used as a marketing play for beans, where you have different flavor, different body, different texture. Perhaps we are, putting a vintage on the packaging. Maybe there's pairing events or festivals or vineyard tours. But I think drawing that connection between, grapes producing these incredible fermented beverage that can be seen as premium and beans kind of being similar. Maybe we're putting tasting notes on there like citrus or smoke or caramel, like the coffee industry does. I just think that's a really strong analogy when we're thinking about how do we change that sub-premium perception.
Yeah,
Definitely.
and there's such opportunity to celebrate that, isn't it? If you think about the amazing diversity that we get in incredible parts of the world. And so those tasting notes, what about beans and wine?
Put
I'm
them
up
together.
for that party. Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen those actually. So people will do bean and wine pairings, and there are certainly dry bean brands that they've really built that brand image. They've built that connection with people, and I've seen ones that write tasting notes on the packages, and they'll demand quite a premium for their product.
I love that. So I think that's a really good takeaway, is to kind of reframe these as you would, a fine wine, and encourage and inspire home chefs, professional chefs to kind of taste for, savor those subtleties and embrace them, to get people to pay more attention to the delicious food that they're consuming.
And also to keep that diversity in place, because, we've seen that we have a bit of a monocrop culture, don't we, around the world. I think it's 4 crops globally, provides about 66% of the world's calories. We do not want that to happen with beans. We want to keep our diversity. We want to celebrate the local kind of nature and the place that beans have had in our history and culture. And so by doing the kind of, what's those beautiful nuances? Where do they grow? What's the atmosphere there? What's the story that we can tell? I think will help to preserve that diversity. And that diversity for consumption and for health is so important. So, eat the rainbow of colours. We often talk about that in dietary kind of habits. The same applies for beans. So chase the colours, embrace the colours, because often, they're polyphenols with those colours as well. So,
Yes, polyphenols, that's right. Well, I think that leads well into our third hurdle to consumer consumption of beans, and that is the sub-premium perception. So we're kind of starting to talk about some marketing ideas here, but I wanted to inspire this group with some significant comeback stories from other commodity foods. So I don't know if you all are aware, but prior to 2012, the largest purchaser of kale in the US was actually Pizza Hut. And it was not for consumption. They were using it to decorate their salad bar and make it look green. And now look at it. It's in smoothies and salads. It's accompanying, Michelin. It's a garnish in Michelin, restaurant foods. Beyonce has it on her T-shirt. And sales are up. Post-pandemic, consumers really started eating more healthily. There was a significant rise in kale sales, almost 11% last year, which is really significant. And let's, of course, not forget that lobster used to be essentially a poor person's food fed to prisoners and slaves. And it wasn't until the invention of canning and the railroad system that you were able to get lobster kind of spread out across the US and it became a delicacy. Now it's consistently one of the most expensive menu items. So there's a perception change success story if I ever saw one. And I wanted to share this really interesting fictional marketing rebrand that was done. It was a combination of the New York Times and Bolthouse Farms, which is a subsidiary of Campbell's, and they set out to answer the question, what if fruits and vegetables were marketed the same way that, processed foods, meat, and dairy were marketed? So of course, the sugar industry, the dairy industry, the meat industry, they all have extensive budgets for marketing, and that marketing is really effective. And so they tested it with broccoli, and they did a whole campaign, and it generated a lot of enthusiasm. Sales in the area increased 23%. Celebrities were getting on board and endorsing it. And after the program ended, a bunch of students at Yale University actually took it and ran with it. They carried the torch. They crowdfunded additional marketing dollars, marketed in their area, and some of the grocery stores in their area saw increases of over 100%. So, spoiler, marketing works, even for something like broccoli. Imagine what it could do for something as delicious as beans. I'm going to kind of fly through this because I want to save time again at the end for questions, but I just wanted to share, beans are kind of seen, they're really affordable. Even the most organic, specialty bean for the most part is still less expensive than, filet mignon or cheeses or wines. But I think there's a really interesting pricing paradox that I want to share with you. So when you see beans included in other products, they help afford attributes like grain-free, gluten-free, high protein that enables them to command a significant price premium. So here we have, a traditional grain-based O, and then we have forager cereal here in the US that uses cassava flour, navy beans, pea protein, and you can see it's commanding nearly double the price per ounce. We see this in multiple categories. Look at Just Egg with their mung bean protein in there. They're 3 times the price of another type of egg-based product. Hip peas, they emphasize that they're made with chickpea, and they are 85% more per ounce than an organic cheese puff. We see it with a company called Right Rice that uses lentil flour, chickpea flour, pea fiber, and rice flour. There's still rice in there, but it's a higher protein, higher fiber product that's 3 times more expensive than the average rice. So, I think beans for product developers, as we learned yesterday, help with a variety of culinary applications. They make things creamy, crunchy, chewy. I can't think of a more versatile food than a bean for a product developer such as myself. And for consumers, as I mentioned, it affords these incredible attributes: high protein, high fiber, grain-free, gluten-free. And for the brands who are marketing these products, they are more differentiated. They have health claims. They're able to get into kind of that specialty diet categorization, have that premium perception, and because of it, command those higher prices. So Allison, I think you coined it, beans are premium in stealth. Right? They're hiding in these products and helping them get the attributes, the textures, the tastes that are enabling price premiums. So I think it's really interesting that beans kind of play in both camps. They are the hearty, inexpensive staple food, and they also can be in this very premium space, which I think is really interesting, and everything in between. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Anything you all would like to add to that, just for thinking about marketing in general?
One short comment is we've spent the last couple of days talking about how amazing beans are, right? Environment, human health, versatility for chefs in the home kitchen, kind of in everything, right? And yet we don't consume enough of them to get a lot of those benefits. So I think everyone in this room is a bean advocate, and this is where we can really all work together to help consumers and to help us all realize that beans are not a poor person's food. They are a perfect food for conscious consumers who really want to advance public and environmental health while enjoying something delicious. So help us with that, and let's go, Bean Team. Let's get people eating more beans.
Thank you. Thank you. Excellent.
And I suppose my final kind of thoughts to this is we've talked very rationally today, haven't we? So we've talked about myths, and that's a very rational discussion that is really important. But most people, most consumers, actually make decisions on an emotional level. So that point of purchase, they're in the shop, they're in a restaurant, they're reaching the store cupboard. So in order to make progress, we have to talk to the emotions. So how can we take some of those myths and, deliciously disrupt and use kind of amazing kind of marketing to really celebrate beans and make sure that they've got the rightful kind of place in the bowl and the plate for people and planet. So let's get emotional.
Thank you. Yes, that's a great point. Well, with that, I'd like to open it up for a short Q&A. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and we'll have somebody come with the mic. We'd like to kick it off with a question actually for Dr. Greger. I don't know if we can put him on the screen.
He must have done 5 miles, right?
I know, yeah. So Dr. Greger, I hope you can hear us. We have a question, and that is, we know that part of the problem in the U.S. is that doctors have a very limited nutrition education. Is it like a class or 2 in medical school?
Yeah, unfortunately, physicians suffer a severe nutrition deficiency in education. Out of thousands of hours of preclinical instruction, the average physician trained in the U.S. Gets less than 20 hours of nutrition training, despite the Global Burden of Disease Study, the largest study of human risk factors for disease in history, funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, finding that the number 1 cause of death in these United States is the American diet. Leading cause of disability, diet. Bumping tobacco to number 2. Cigarettes now only kill about 500,000 Americans every year, whereas our diet kills even more. So is it the number 1 thing taught in medical school? Hardly. It's hardly taught at all, unfortunately.
Yeah, so I know that there have been, at least in my bubble, a growth of lifestyle medicine. At least it's becoming a more common term. Are you hopeful about the future and connection to diet as a form of preventative medicine? And from your purview, are you starting to see a shift in the medical field that looks encouraging?
Oh, absolutely. The American College of Lifestyle Medicine, of which I'm a proud founding member, is the fastest growing medical subspecialty in the United States. And if you look at their food guidelines, what they emphasize as the best source of protein, legumes, beans, split peas, chickpeas, and lentils. And so just like the blue zones, right, that's what ties them all together in the Venn diagram, is centering their diet around the chief protein source of legumes. And indeed, the Global Burden of Disease Study just last year, of all food categories, legumes associated with longevity the most, associated with literally years of added life with extra legume consumption. My new book, How Not to Age, coming out in December on all the longevity research, could be summed up in 3 words: eat more beans. And that's primarily surrounding methionine restriction. And so just like the prebiotics that may cause gas are actually beneficial, and the phytates that have had this bad rap may actually be beneficial, the relatively low methionine levels of essential amino acid in beans may actually be one of the reasons beans are so good for us. So I encourage people to check out, I have videos on all these, of course, on nutritionfacts.org. I encourage people to check out my new book from their local public library. All proceeds from all the sales of my books are donated to charity.
That's wonderful. Thank you. And again, the takeaway is the fastest growing medical subsegment sees beans as the protein source, which I think is a great wagon for us all to be on. And then I love that your book can be summed up in 3 words: eat more beans. I think that's really promising. I know this is more of a creative question, but is there anything that the bean industry can do to support the medical community in enhancing nutrition education? Is there a marketing responsibility that you feel we share to educate the consumer?
Well, 2 things about the industry that I'd love to see, just from a medical perspective, is one. I know we have panelists not liking to villainize food components, but if there's any food component to villainize, it is sodium, probably the number one dietary risk factor for death on the planet Earth. The Global Burden of Disease study suggests 4 million lives prematurely ended every year because of excess sodium consumption. And so I encourage people to go for those no sodium added beans. So I'd like to see more of that in the canned bean arena, so people don't have to waste time cooking their own. And also there's one company, Eden Foods, has a line of canned beans that actually has kombu added, which is a type of kelp, which adds just the amount of iodine such that eating a can of beans gets 150 micrograms of iodine for the day. And that's actually something that people eating really healthy diets may not get enough of because, at least in the States, table salt is iodized. I encourage people to cut down on salt. Where they're going to get their iodine from? There's sea vegetables. There's lots of healthy sources. But wouldn't it be great to just say, well, when you get your beans, you get your iodine too? I'd love to see other bean producers add a little kombu, just a teeny amount to get that to get some iodine into the beans as well.
That's an interesting consideration that I'll take to Plant Strong, but I think broadly for this group, I know we have some representatives with Bush's and other brands here, making sure that you have a no salt added option for those health conscious consumers is an important takeaway. And I know I need to personally reduce my sodium, so thank you for that reminder. Are there any additional questions for our panelists? Yes, I see one in the front, sure. Microphone's coming to the gentleman sitting up front.
Well, thank you, Doctor. I want to, first of all, congratulate you for being a founder of this amazing lifestyle medicine. I have a very selfish question. I'm a physician myself, and I would love to be a member of that association. So what are the requirements to be part of that?
Well, any physician can join as a member. In fact, we have allied professions as well. Spots for dietitians, et cetera. In terms of being certified by the board, there's the kind of typical requirements of, a certain amount of, of CMEs and professional credentials, et cetera. But anyone can join to be a member. It's a very exciting development here in the U.S. We saw just a few months ago, all 11 public health hospitals in New York City are going to default plant-based meals. A primary constituent of those meals are legumes. And so that's over 1 million meals a month because 60% of consumers stuck with the default plant-based option. And we are hoping to expand that to other health institutions. And so there's another great industry opportunity to get some of the healthiest foods where we need them in America's hospitals.
Those are promising activities that I think will serve to inspire other areas. That's very exciting. And sir, if you want to connect with me afterwards, I can give you some more information about the ACLM. It's something I'm familiar with. I think we have time maybe for one other question. We're pushing our luck on the timing, but yes.
Great job to this panel.
Thank you.
One question I have is, I already have a partner that has a significant amount of flatulence, and I would love to introduce more beans into our diet, in her diet. My question is, what do I expect, and is my life in danger?
I mean, no, because you're partying together, right? But if your goal is to maybe reduce some symptoms that you or loved ones are experiencing, then kind of like we talked about, you can try different varieties and everything, because some people do react differently to different varieties, and even within one type of bean, there are multiple varieties within that, and so there is that variation in response. One of the other recommendations, if you're cooking beans at home, is to soak them. My mic, okay, it's back. And discard the soaking water, because you can get rid of some of the galacto-oligosaccharides in there, and those are associated with some of the flatulence. That being said, those very same compounds may have health benefits, so it's kind of, you have to make those decisions. But maybe you could try that, start with that, kind of work up to getting used to it, and have fun experimenting.
Yes, and remember that it is a transition period. So maybe, there's a week where you sleep in separate bedrooms, just while you make that change. So with that, one more question, then we'll have to wrap it.
Sí, gracias. Felicidades por el panel. Nos ha enriquecido mucho. Gracias. Y yo vengo de México y nosotros consumimos en la dieta muchos frijoles. De hecho, somos de los principales clientes de los socios del Consejo en la importación de frijol. El día de ayer tuvimos la experiencia de ir a los supermercados aquí en Medellín y encontramos un producto que es frijol verde, que se quita la vaina y se empaca como legumbre, como producto fresco, se refrigera y en otros casos se congela. La pregunta es, técnicamente, ¿esto pudiera disminuir, mitigar la flatulencia al no dejar que se seque el producto para su consumo? Es la pregunta.
Okay.
So do you have the interpretation devices? No, you don't. Okay, so basically he is congratulating everyone here in the summit. And he is from Mexico. They are importers. And basically they visited a supermarket yesterday where they noticed that there is a green bean that has been taken out of the vein. It's frozen or refrigerated. And they are wondering if the fact that it's a more fresh bean could help to have less possibilities of flatulence.
But I answered.
Yeah, excuse me. It's instead of the dry bean, it's green.
No, I
bean.
heard his question. It was more just, it's another kind of one of those, it depends. I don't know what the product was or what the original, like what variety it was. Was it a type that normally you would dry down and then cook?
It's a Colombian variety. It's a cargamanto bean.
Cargamanto? Okay.
But it's not dry. It's
right.
Fresh. Right.
I don't know. Can you hear me? My mic kind of keeps going in and out.
Yep.
I'm not sure that would impact it one way or another, to be honest, because again, it can depend on the variety and everything. And if you're going to be cooking it in the end, and if you're having fiber to begin with, I don't know that it would have much of a differential impact versus the cargamanto bean that has been dried and then cooked. But I know that, again, I'm not sure that there's an exact answer for that. Would anybody else like to chime in? I don't know that the galacto-oligosaccharides would necessarily be different if it was dried down. But it also depends on when it was harvested, like how.
Thank you, Chelsea.
My mic is dying.
It's time to stop. Thank you, Chelsea. And I know that we'll be talking more about frozen refrigerated beans in a later panel session. So with that, I would like to thank our wonderful panelists. Thank you, Chelsea. Thank you, Allison. Thank you, Dr. Greger, for being a part of this.
Jess, this is Rebecca.
Hi.
I'm going to just make an executive decision here
Sure.
to ask one more question.
Yeah, okay.
Because this panel is incredible, and I love the information I'm hearing. This is such an important discussion, and I just think it's important because this is something that impacts so much of the global population. I wondered if any of you, Dr. Greger, or any of you might speak a little bit about the impact of eating more beans on diabetes, because bean, it does have carbohydrates, and carbohydrates convert to sugar, and obviously it would seem that that's the last thing that a diabetic person would want to consume to control their blood sugar, but I understand that it's actually the opposite. So I wondered if any of you or Dr. Greger might be able to speak to that quickly.
Thank you. Great question. Dr. G, I feel like that's for you.
Oh, I'd love to. I have lots of videos on legumes and diabetes. on nutritionfacts.org, not only is it an extremely low glycemic load food, but there's something called the so-called lentil effect. It's since been renamed when we discovered that it's not just an effect solely on lentils, but in all dried beans, where the consumption of beans lowers blood sugars the next day, 12 hours later, in response to the same carbohydrate load, thanks to the effects of the prebiotics, the resistant starch and fiber in those beans. By, we eat a bean burrito for supper, and by the next morning, our good bugs are eating that same bean burrito, producing these short chain fatty acids like butyrate, which not only feed the lining of our colon, actually absorbed into our bloodstream, circulate throughout our system, have anti-inflammatory effects, have all sorts of wonderful effects, including reducing appetite. And so you actually eat less. You feel just as full, eating hundreds of calories less for breakfast the next day because you ate beans the night before, and the blood sugar spike to whether you give them a cup of sugar water or something, significantly lower if you had, again, beans the night before. So not only does beans compared to other sources of carbohydrates give you lower blood sugar levels during that meal, but even 12 hours later. So that's why the American Diabetes Association encourages diabetics to include legumes every day. And of course, the American Institute for Cancer Research recommends legumes three servings a day. So breakfast, lunch, and dinner, let's get our beans in.
That is such a great answer. And for those who missed it, there's a video on his website about the second meal effect. And in layman's terms, if you yourself are suffering from diabetes, or if you have a loved one, the profound attribute that showed me that beans are truly superior when it comes to nutrition is they gave two groups of participants, one bread, the other an equal amount of carbohydrates, but from beans, and monitored their blood sugar. As expected, the bread group spiked, and the bean group was more, rounded because of that lower glycemic response. And then they fed them the exact same meal for lunch, and the group that had the beans for breakfast had a softer curve, a more blunted but blood sugar impact. Same meal, better insulin response because of beans. I have goosebumps. I literally have goosebumps. That is so profound. So again, I highly recommend checking out that video. And thank you, Rebecca, for a great question, because again, it impacts so many people around the world. Excellent. All right.
Actually, types of starches, and I guess I'm just going to yell, and I'm sorry if it gets really loud when the mic works. So there's amylose and amylopectin, for example. There are two different types of starches in beans, and amylopectin is really branched, and so your body can kind of break it down faster. You're getting a faster release, and amylose takes longer to break down. It's more of a straight chain. And so beans actually have a higher ratio of this, and so that's maybe another reason, plus the resistant starches, plus all of this, that we're just seeing kind of a slower breakdown, and they have a lower glycemic index.
Great. Thank you. That's a wonderful add. Excellent. All right. With that, if there's no additional questions, come find us afterwards. I think we're open to continuing the conversation about beans. And we're so grateful to be able to have this time with this fantastic panel. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.